I'm so excited this afternoon to introduce Lionel Barber, who was editor of the Financial Times for 2005 to 2020. Prior to that, he's a journalist for The Scotsman and The Sunday Times. Over the course of his career, he has interviewed a number of prominent figures. His private diaries from this period are now available in book format and on sale outside, published as The Powerful and the Damned. Welcome to the Cambridge Union, Lionel.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Lovely to have you. I just wanted to start by asking what's going on with you right now?
Well, I'm trying to recover from this Washington heat wave, which we've had. You know, the most important thing is that there's life after the FT. I'm doing a variety of things like doing some writing still for different publications around the world. I've put some money into the New European, yes, which was a pop-up newspaper, which is increasing its circulation. We're going to have a new digital format soon. I'm on the board of Carnegie Corporation in New York, which has an endowment of about $4 billion, and just been asked to help find the next president after Vartan Gregorian's distinguished reign. And then I write for Nikkei. And lastly, I'm mentoring a couple of people who are perhaps a little less fortunate than we all are to try and help someone. So that's what I'm up to, in short.
Thanks so much. I just want to clarify a few things about the format. So this will be a short 20-ish minute interview, and then I'll open up to questions for the floor. So if you have anything you want to ask Lionel, be thinking during the interview. My first question is, you've interviewed a number of powerful people. What goes through your head when you're interviewing them?
Well, the most important thing when you're interviewing somebody really important is to keep a clear head. So you've got to feel that you've been well prepared, or not feel, know, not overscript it, and be alert to that moment when there needs to be a follow-up question and you may have to depart from your script. And I think the last thing, and we can obviously talk about, and by the way, I just wanted to say something before I talk more, is I really appreciate you coming here, given that this is exam time and, you know, good for you. You're not being stuck in just your rooms swatting or rehearsing or whatever. Anyway, so we can talk about some of the people I've interviewed, from Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump or Obama or Cameron or Wen Jiabao in China. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people. The crucial thing is you've got to find some way of empathizing, because that's where you're going to open up. It's no good just trying to put them on the spot, because these powerful people, they're well prepared. You won't get anything out of them. So the key is to try and unlock them. Now, you can be smarmy, but that doesn't really do any good. But if you can say something at the beginning of the interview which catches their attention, then that's the way to do it. And so what I did with Vladimir Putin was speak to him in German. And I knew, and he knows, that he was a KGB agent in Dresden. And, you know, he didn't kind of go, he didn't say, "What is this in Russian? How dare you address me in German?" He actually spoke back. And we had a little bit of banter, which consisted of him saying, where did you learn your German? And I said, well, at Oxford. And he said, what do you study at Oxford? And I said, German and modern history. And then he said, what is modern history? And at that moment, that's when my head began to get scrambled, because I'm speaking to him in German. I'm thinking, what should I say modern history is for him that's going to get his attention? So I said, everything after 1989. Which kind of, he went, okay, smart ass, fine, you know.
And I think a follow-up question to that is, how did you determine what that rapport was for each individual? What would you say was your hardest interviewee to establish that rapport with?
Massively hard with Jacques Delors, because I was doing it in French, and Delors speaks at about 100 miles an hour, and he loses a lot of the French in the throat, and he also speaks colloquial French. So I was trying to keep up with his French, and this was, you know, I don't know whether you were around at the time, probably you're too young, 18, no, most of you would not be around. I remember when there was the collapse of the European exchange rate mechanism, currency crisis, Britain humiliated, Black Wednesday, and everybody thought Europe was going to collapse. And I was interviewing him, and he took it personally. So anyway, I think the thing is, there's one other tip. I mean, I would, by the way, just look at, if you're really interested in interviewing, look at what David Frost used to say about interviewing, because he's very good. I wrote a piece as well in the FT about the art of the interview, which you could look up online. But the other thing is, don't leave the room too early. Don't leave something on the table. Now, there's a way of doing that. You know, you can apply glue. That's a joke, by the way, you're supposed to laugh. But not to sort of say, you know, I just want, I used to do this for ages. Well into my 40s, I'd be going, I've just got one more question. Then, could I have another question? And I mean, it's pathetic. So you just stay calm and wait to be asked to leave, really. Right?
I think that might be good advice for any situation that you just want to stay in.
Well, you're a psychologist. You study psychology, so you know all about that. I mean, it is about, when you're interviewing somebody, it is who's going to actually try and dominate, set the terms of the discussion. So someone like Putin, I mean, he's a KGB agent. I mean, he's brilliant at doing that. I used to call him the master of destabilization, because his whole thing is to make you feel smaller and not quite sure of yourself, even though he was being quite polite with me. But someone like Trump, I mean, it's all about the sort of dominating, so that then you're slightly cowed if you're not careful, and you don't get to answer the questions that you want.
Did you let people like Trump or Putin feel like they were dominating when you were really guiding the interview from the inside?
With Putin, I talked to two very good American friends who had been in meetings with Putin. One had been the longtime ambassador. He's now director of the CIA, Bill Burns. And I rang him up and I said, look, what's the thing? And the other one was Bob Zoellick, who's the president of the World Bank. He'd also advised Baker during the Cold War and knew Putin, and, you know. And they both said, the one thing you should do is don't try and put him on the spot. Just show, you don't need to be deferential, but show a degree of respect. Just, and try and establish that rapport. And I think that was very good advice. So I don't think I was being smarmy in any way. I did laugh at one of his sort of jokes, which probably was a bit smarmy, but, you know. I mean, it was an hour and 30 minutes.
What was that joke?
I think it was basically, I'm trying to think, it was, he made oh yes, that's right. He said, because the KGB, they speak in double negatives. So it's always, you have to kind of go, what did you just say? And I asked him, which was a question actually Burns had slightly prepped me on, because I said, have you got one question? Because as far as I'm concerned, I just want to win. I want the story, right? And so I did ask people, a lot of the questions you'd say, no, that's no good. But there were two killer questions. The first one, which is where the joke's coming in, was, do you think, Mr. President, Mr. President, that your risk appetite has increased the longer you've been in power? And he thought about it, and he kind of goes, no, he kind of plays for time a bit while he's thinking. And then he says, not really, but then he says, but of course. I won't try and do the accent, but you know, of course. You know, person who does not, you know, if you don't, now I'm just remembering, trying to get the words right, but essentially the person who does not gamble does not get to drink the champagne. And that's the Russian, I mean, it's a Russian proverb. And I'm kind of going, oh, yes, of course, you know. Well, I didn't do it like that, but, you know. But just to sort of, you know, appreciate the comment. And of course, it's a great quote. So you know. But the second one was, you know, I wasn't going to move until the conversation needed to, you know, the gears to engage, and where you're going to actually ask the question which is going to get a rise out of him. And that was a question, actually, my younger brother, who's a Russian expert at the FT, and he said, what you should do is ask him, and it went like this. I say, well, as you know, Mr. President Putin, populism is on the march. It's on the increase in America, you know, in France, in Spain, Italy. Dramatic little theatrical pause. So he's wondering, where's this going? How long can Russia remain immune to that populism? And he was, for the moment, he was just slightly off balance. And then he said, that's when he came out with this amazing quote, which was, the liberal idea is obsolete. You know, all this multiculturalism, and you guys are decadent. You know, you don't know what gender fluidity, all this. And it was just amazing. And I thought, oh my God, now I've got it. That's the story. So that's a long answer, but it's kind of interesting to talk about how the interview develops.
Yeah, I'm sure we all learned a lot from that. I think we had a debate a few months ago on the motion, has liberalism failed us?
Yeah.
What would you say to critics of liberalism?
Well, first of all, you have a problem if America, which has been embodied, I mean, for all its faults, largely on the right side of history, but is the sort of standard bearer of what we used to know as the West. And you've got a president who thinks he's above the law. He's essentially a kind of authoritarian figure. You know, he's trying to steal the election. He incites an insurrection in January the 5th. And that's your moral standard bearer, or your standard bearer. I mean, so in other words, there's a lot of self-harm done. I also think, and I've written this, that referendum are, you know, they undermine representative government and democracy, representative democracy. So liberalism has done, that's been a problem. I think the other is, if you haven't read it, I would really recommend a book called The Light That Failed, which is Ivan Krastev, who's a Bulgarian writer, and I think it's Stephen Holmes or Peter Holmes. It's a brilliant book about what's gone wrong with liberalism, and essentially arguing, and he takes you through Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, through Russia, and then China, where essentially liberalism is trying to export itself, and these countries, they buy into it, but they don't really buy into it because it's anathema to their political culture and tradition. And essentially the argument is liberalism's overextended itself, right? It's a very good book. I think that's true. But lastly, you know, when Putin said this, of course he's ignoring that there are aspects of liberalism and the liberal idea which are absolutely essential, which are a huge threat to him. And that, what I mean by that is the freedom of the press, pluralism, you know, dissent in an honorable tradition. So it's not the end of the liberal idea, although I write it in my book that my favorite book is President at the Creation, Dean Acheson's memoir, when essentially America's role was defined by that post-war generation as guarantor of the West liberal idea, security, etc., and indeed in Asia as well. That then I was present at the destruction, and that's a bit of a literary kind of exaggeration, but there's some truth in it because of the damage that I've described.
On the question of the free press, in your book, you've spoken about a conflict that arises from a proximity to power and keeping up with a journalistic duty to hold powerful people to account. How did you navigate that conflict?
Well, I'm going to sound very American here, which is a great question. But it's an essential question because this is double-edged. I mean, you know that when you get access, that can act as a form of control. You can, if you're not careful, self-censor. And access is a form of co-option if you're not on your mettle. But my view was overall it was worth it because you're dealing and talking to principals. You're not dealing with secondary sources. You're not dealing with the PR people. You're not dealing with toadies or flunkies or other such specimen. You're dealing with the principal, and you have a chance to look at them in the eye and say, well, okay, what are they like? And how do they respond under pressure to questions? And that's your role. And if you're the editor of the FT, which is what I was for 14 years, that brings a certain experience and standing where they're probably going to answer your questions more if you're there. But there is a dilemma. You can get too close. I mean, always people will try and ask you to, could you do this? Or what about that? Or, well, you did get this interview. And you always just have to say, you know what? No, there's no deal here. The one line I did draw, I remember, which sort of sums up the answer maybe to your question, which is I remember when we got the interview with Barack Obama, which was one of the first in the West, and we saw him in April, and I always remember going out on the plane, literally, to Washington for 24 hours, and I, couldn't resist just telling one of the air stewardesses that I was going to interview Barack Obama at the White House, and she collapsed in a heap and just said, "Oh my God, that's just amazing." And I'm flying back the next night. Are you on the same plane? Yes, right. I've got to hear all about it. But when we were in the Oval, it wasn't the Oval Office, it was the Roosevelt Room. My colleagues sort of half joked that they'd like to get Barack Obama's autograph, and I said, "Are you joking? No. We're not doing that. We can't do that." Because that would have been just too much. I mean, great for the kids, but you don't want to do that. You have to keep a certain discrete distance.
On that question of a discrete distance and the role of the press, you've indicated in other interviews that you feel like your interviews are a chance to test the people's account. How do you think the role of the press in general and the role of the FT in specific changed throughout your tenure with the changes that came in the geopolitical landscape?
Yeah. Well, again, that's a very big question. So I would divide the answer into two, which is one, how did the political landscape change? And the second is, how did the media landscape change? So to take the first, obviously, we had a credit bubble, a financial crisis, a global financial crisis, where the banking system literally almost melted down. And then there was a political reaction, a sort of summed up anti-globalization, populism. Interesting, a little less so from the left. I remember the Occupy Wall Street movement. It didn't really take off, actually. Immigration was the big thing, and it was a right-wing populism more than the left. It's not, I'm speaking very broad brush here. So, the question for the FT, and I would be a bit of self-critical here, I think we didn't quite understand the power of that. I say in the book, I did take a lot of stick because I asked Nigel Farage to appear at an event, and a couple of the judges on this panel, FT event, resigned because he said he was a racist. And I said, well, I don't particularly like him. And I know he went to my old school when he was known as Nigel Farage, and he's now known as Nigel Farage, as in sort of garage, you know. But the answer is we kind of thought that we looked at it too rationally in terms of economics, and we can talk about Brexit on that. Now, on the media side, what changed was everything speeded up, and the news cycle was crushed. Everybody had a voice. They could answer back big time through social media, and the media landscape fragmented. And then suddenly, people started talking about alternative facts. So my facts are, you know, I'm entitled to my facts, and you can have your facts, but, you know, ne'er the two shall meet. So for a journalist like me, I'm saying, well, there are facts. So the FT, we decided we would really make sure that we showed facts matter. And one of the ways of doing that was through investigative journalism. You can talk about that. We did some very big stories. Obviously, the Greensill stories just come out, but under my watch, Wirecard didn't quite, you know, it didn't come to a denouement, but we wrote all the major stories in the last year of my editorship. And that was a huge story because we had the whole German establishment on us, against us. So I think those are the two phenomena, which is how do you deal with populism? How do you report on it? And then how do you deal with alternative facts, people blathering on about post-truth era, which I think is rubbish.
On that rationality question, with people getting their news or getting their opinions from so many different sources, some of which hold more relationship to the truth than others, how would you say that you could see that print media has a way forward and can combat this phenomenon?
Well, first of all, everybody in the room has to understand that we can't really talk about print media anymore because all print newspapers have digital websites, digital operations, so they can do social media, they can do video, they can do, you know, amazing stuff. So the question then is, what are they doing to stand out in a very crowded market, a fragmented market as well? And that then comes down to both speciality, trustworthiness, and, you know, frankly, you can't cut your way to quality. And one of the things, I wrote a piece on this recently, one of the most devastating things that's happened to the media is that people have cut newsrooms and they've cut the revise process, the process of a second or third pair of eyes. So a lot of the material is just, it's wrong. It's just factually inaccurate. Now, anybody who reads this, I mean, can you imagine? So I'm interviewing you, right? And I you know, I can't even get your age right. I don't get your address. It's misspelt. I mean, you're going to look at it and just go, well, pathetic. I'm not going back there again. So I think I was very, very keen. You know, when I took over as editor, didn't expect to be made editor. You know, I was 50. I thought, you know, I had a really good career, didn't expect to be made editor. I had to take over a place which was actually had some problems. So I just said, you know what? No story will ever appear in the FT again without 2 independent sources. And it was amazing. Everybody goes, oh, yeah, I remember that. I said, yeah, you bet. We're not going to do it. So of course we made mistakes, but you know what? We never screwed up big time. And so you need some rules like that, but then you also need the revise function.
I wanted to have you speak a little bit more on that. You were credited with the FT going online really, really quickly and with a subscription model. If you could just speak to the audience about your process.
I mean, look, actually, I should not take all the credit for that because it was a management team. I said I was 50, which is important because it meant that I'd been a long-time foreign correspondent. You know, I've done 6 years in Brussels, 6 years in Washington, 4 years as a writer stroke executive in New York. So I kind of had a lot of stuff under my belt. So when I was on the board, you know, when I spoke, people listened, right? and also being in America, you know this. I mean, the fact is, you've got more of a commercial nose. So I did say, we got to raise prices. We're underpriced. Now, normally an editor wouldn't say that because they'd be just saying it's all about editorial. Well, it wasn't. I wanted to play a bigger role than that. But there were other people who came up with, and there was two people said things, and this wasn't me, it was on the management board. One was a Chinese American who was in his late 20s, and he had sort of 3 brains. And he said, what we need to do is come up with a model so people can taste FT content, but then we'll make them pay. But we got to sort of, and then what we'll do is gradually we will reduce the amount of free content and then flip them into a subscription. Crucial. The second guy said, we have to sell direct to customers. We can't be taking what we think is a fat check from these aggregators like Factiva or whatever, and they get to distribute our content. We should sell content direct as a subscription business. Absolutely key insight. It's about not being disintermediated. So by the way, five years on, very, very important, when Facebook came to the FT and said, I'm slightly making this because I don't want to get anybody into trouble, but, well, maybe I would, but anyway. But, Facebook wanted half our content at the weekend and they'd pay us X. And I just said, no, we're not doing that. I mean, you can't be taking just money from Facebook. We need to sell, we have the confidence to sell direct and be a premium product. So that's a little bit of the answer that I guess you're looking for.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to ask, what has been the most unexpected direction an interview has gone?
Well, I never expected to spend 3.5 hours with Paul Kagame. And by the end, my backside was just aching. I mean, it just went on and on. It was the history of Rwanda. It was an amazing interview. The most unexpected thing, I think I say this in the book, and again, I better not do accents because I'll get in trouble, but I remember I was in Colombia, in Bogota, and I really wanted to go to Colombia because it's a beautiful country, and I've been in Brazil before, and my colleague, who was a brilliant journalist, said, you'll really love Colombia. And I remember the drug wars in the 90s when the country was a narco state and it just almost collapsed. Anyway, the hard man was this guy called Alvaro Uribe. Anyway, finally, we hear that we've got the interview. And this is how it goes. I've got 2 minutes here, right? So we go into the palace. I've been in places in security. This was unbelievable. I mean, it was tighter security than the Knesset in Israel. It was amazing. And then when we finally got in, there were women with submachine guns just walking up and down. I mean, quite kind of formidable. And we sat there, and somebody offers you coffee, still waiting, a couple of hours. I've had 4 coffees, scraped me off the ceiling. And then this little guy comes along and says, Senor Barber, because I just said, where the hell is Uribe? I mean, where is this interview going? I mean, I've been waiting 2.5 hours. And this guy comes up and he goes, Senor Barber? I go, yeah. He says, El Presidente, he very sorry for you. He very busy. I go, okay. He says, maybe he see you in Washington, a big problem. He says, maybe interview take a place in 2 hours. Okay. Anyway, guy disappears. And I look at my colleague and I say, I can't believe it. I mean, 2 hours, this is ridiculous. Anyway, who was that jerk? He said, that was the president. He'd spoken in the third person. Anyway, so I get in the interview and I'm thinking, I'm so pissed. I've waited 4 hours for this. Anyway, we sit down and I've got this question, right? Which I'd prepared because I thought about what am I going to ask him? And there was a question of whether he was going to disturb or rewrite the Constitution so he could have 3 terms. But the Colombia Constitution only has 2 terms. And so after he'd explained why the meeting was delayed and the problems with Venezuela and God knows what, he says, okay, first question. And I said to him, I looked at him and I said, Mr. President, if 2 terms were good enough for George Washington, why aren't 2 terms good enough for Alvaro Uribe? And he jumps up, he's got his fist like this, and he starts advancing to me, and I'm thinking, he's going to smack me in the face. And then he suddenly bursts out into this big smile and says, I am still looking for my Thomas Jefferson. That was probably the most unexpected thing in an interview. It was really funny. So I had a good story.
I wanted to speak about the changes that you brought as well as editor of the FT. The FT had been criticized historically for not showcasing enough diversity, whether this be racial diversity or diversity of viewpoints being in a bubble. I think we get the same criticism as the union as being in the Cambridge bubble. How did you manage this, and what would you say the FT could have done better?
So, again, great question. But it's a serious question. And I did think about it a lot. And I have thought about it. First, I'm not going to make any excuses. The place was a mess. And it needed straightening out. So you need to find the people that you really can trust. And they are going to be really good. And it's not a time for gestures. Now, I needed to put that team together. And also, I didn't need to go Mao in the newsroom. And what I mean by that is just throw everything out, revolution. We needed to have incremental, steady change, set the standards, get a basis, and from there. The second issue is, frankly, some of the appointments, and they were a bit diverse, were not good enough. So I then said, we need to now start addressing gender balance, right? And 1 or 2 women also encouraged me and said, you know, you need to do more. And I said, yeah, give me a bit of time. But I said also, I don't just want to appoint somebody. I want to have a program in the FT where we're identifying women, including people I think are really good, who are going to be the leaders in 5, 6, 7 years. Because I want to have that way, right? Now, that happened. By the time I left, it was 50-50 at the top. And my successor, as you know, is a woman. Now, she didn't get that job because she's a woman. She's, you know, British, but born in Lebanon, amazing woman. I promoted her, and she was my deputy, and she got that job fair and square. On the diversity of viewpoint, I think we could have done better, faster. I agree to that. And I think I pushed, but sometimes you don't get enough. I think on Brexit, we could have had more diversity, but some of the stuff that was pro-Brexit was literally illiterate and wrong. In terms of ethnic diversity, I think we've been weak on Afro-Caribbean. That's been addressed a bit since I left. And on sort of Asian Britain and stuff, we're pretty good, not good enough. And then in terms of sexual diversity, I mean, you're sensitive to it, but you're not going to just appoint someone because we need to have somebody who's gender fluid or whatever in the room. I think the most important thing is to do things where you're not making a gesture, that it's serious, and it's not just something you do like that. You're planning, and you've got a pipeline. And then I'll just say one last thing, because I do want to try and answer this question honestly. I think probably I needed to be pushed a bit, because I wasn't sufficiently sensitive to, look, you can't expect it just to be there. You may need to go that extra mile to get the extra diversity. And I think that's definitely happening now. So it's a long answer. Try to be honest about it. I think it came good in the end.
I think I also wanted to ask about ideological diversity. You've said the FT proudly champions liberalization and globalization.
Yeah.
My question is twofold. The first is, how do you manage those guiding aims while ensuring a diversity in, for example, editorial and op-eds? And the second is, how do you think those values can sort of persuasively, quote unquote, win?
Well, first of all, if you looked at the politics of the last 10 years, you know that you can't have untrammeled globalization. I mean, look at the IMF's position on capital flows, for example, now compared to 20 years ago during the Asian financial crisis. I mean, thinking has evolved. I would say that we need to have a sensible critique of globalization. And we did that. We talked about new model capitalism in 2019. We changed the sort of marketing slogan. In the end, we are writing largely for business and finance. So we're not going to have Jeremy Corbyn on, we did ask him to lunch, but he didn't come for some reason. I mean, I'm not going to do things for tokenism. What I did do was say, and if anybody's interested in the modern labor market, we have the best reporter on the modern labor market. She's just amazing, called Sarah O'Connor, and I gave her a column because what she writes about inequality in the labor market, if you read her pieces on the decline of seaside towns built around Blackpool, in terms of a portrait of socioeconomic decay, how it's happened. Look at her piece on working at Amazon that she did 5 years ago, well before this became an issue. I mean, that for me is more important, that we have people who will really expose and then let people have their own mind. I'm not going to have a sort of painting by numbers attitude. I mean, I'm not running stuff, but that's not what I work. That's not what I do. I didn't do.
My last question before I open it up to the floor is, we have a number of young journalists probably watching on the stream. What would you say your one biggest piece of advice to them is?
Stay curious. Don't be cynical. The moment I used to go nuts, I used to kind of throw paper around or up in the air during morning news conference because I like to have a bit of theatre, wake everybody up. But if somebody said, "Oh, well, we've heard about that," I just go nuts because that kind of, it's sort of, we know that. No, you didn't know that because you don't know what the story behind the story. You're never going to find out anything. So stay curious. Don't be cynical. That way, you're going to be a good reporter and a good journalist.
All right. Thank you. Just a reminder to keep your mask on and wait for a mic to get to you. But questions? You in the Navy.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. My question is, if you read the FT, I assume you still read it, what's the first thing you read, or who is the first one you read?
I will always read Janan Ganesh. He's just a beautiful writer. He's always original. He's just a unique voice. So I read him on Saturday, always look at the lunch of the FT. Then, Sarah, I read her columns religiously. The first, I always look to see what the lengthy read is on the big read. What do they chosen, decide is something worth devoting 2,000 words to? There is a piece today, I always read what he writes. He only got a monthly column, which compares President Xi's China to the kind of Russian czars in the 19th century, which is a brilliant piece. You may not agree with it, but it's well worth reading. So there are kind of, I better not mention any more names, but I probably will check the main story, but then I'll look at the opinion of some of my favorite writers. And then go into the go and have some spinach after that.
Thank you. I also always start with Mr. Ganesh.
The man right behind you.
Thank you. There seems to be a great distrust and dislike of finance among the public. Why do you think that is, and do you think that's justified?
Well, there is something called financial engineering where, there are deals which are constructed where maybe people can gain excess returns on those deals. I think more important probably, which occurs to me, is what's happening in the market where people are now investing. I know that, it's a bit like that story in J.K. Galbraith when he's having his shoes clean in Grand Central Station, and the shoe shine boy says, "By the way, this stock's really good," and he goes, "This is really bad," in the Great Crash. The point is, people don't trust the markets; they think it's for the big guys, and that's why you've had these extraordinary developments where people are investing in things like Bitcoin or memes. And that essentially, I think that's part of the same anti-establishment, anti-authority tendency. And we don't trust you. So let's go and try. We really believe that AMC cinema chain is not worth $5, it's worth $80. But, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. It's in the middle of COVID. So I think that's what's going on. There's a sort of broader political swell, political cultural feeling, which is very, especially amongst the younger generation. And I think it's to do also with inequality. The notion that somehow the whole game is rigged and the big guys are going to make the big money. That's what's going on. That's maybe a bit simplistic, but I think there's something to that.
You in the back row in the light blue.
Hello, thanks very much. I just wanted to ask, you've talked about the role of the press in a liberal society to be one of the checks on power. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the checks that keep the press free, open, critical? And what do you think could be done to improve that?
Oh, so you're talking now about the sort of who guards the guardians?
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah. So I'm not in favor of politicians regulating the press or having it. I think there are criminal laws which need to be enforced. And by the way, they weren't enforced on phone hacking. The Metropolitan Police was in on the game with the tabloids. That should have been dealt with through criminal law. I mean, now is. And this scandal is, by the way, bankrupting part of Rupert Murdoch's empire, and I mean, it's destroying the tabloid press business model. So I think the second is that having a respected it's not a statutory regulator, but a regulator where you have maybe an ex-lawyer or someone who is enforcing the code of conduct, which all newspapers have to sign up to. That's a pretty good piece of work. I mean, I've contributed to it. It's serious. Now, what I also did, and I by the way, this was not an easy decision, but we didn't join that press grouping, that industry grouping, and instead we appointed our own complaints commissioner, which is a bit like an ombudsman. And that person was allowed to investigate complaints against the FT. I needed a couple of weeks to look at it first, the complaint. It didn't go straight to the commissioner, because maybe we could sort it out before. But once that he had that complaint, I mean, believe me, it was like a dog with a bone. And it was painful sometimes, but we did it. And I think that's a good system. So are you there?
You in the middle row at the end of the row in the black.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned a second ago about a sentiment that's very anti-establishment. And I think from what you said, it sounds like you've had a pretty, I guess, establishment background. Given that, how do you manage to, I suppose, put a finger in the wind and understand what it is that people actually want to read about?
So, first of all, and I'm not wearing this on my sleeve, but my father left school at 15. He came from Leeds. He's totally self-educated, didn't go to university, went straight into newspapers when he was about 17. I grew up, I'm a scholarship kid in South London, didn't go to prep school, whatever. So I may be now seen as a bit establishment. I can't change the way I look, but believe me, I don't see myself. And if I'm a journalist, second answer to your question is go and actually talk to people. I didn't sit in my office. I mean, when I was in various parts of the world, I always went to the places where, a little dodgy, or, whether the slums of Mumbai or Sao Paulo, in Sichuan where the earthquake was, and saw things with my own eyes. And I encouraged journalists to do that. I think it's one of the big problems of COVID, where they're just looking at computer screens. I think the other point, which is a fair point, which you're alluding to, is, and I was talking with a younger journalist today about this earlier, or yet this week, is look, if something's going on like in the financial market, which is extraordinary, these groups of people who don't have a lot of money, they're either making a lot short term, they could lose it, or the younger generation are getting in the market, including my actor son. What's going on? Well, you've got to talk to them. You can't just opine without actually talking to them and interviewing them. So that's what I would say, is don't sit in the office, get out. And maybe lastly, again, which you're alluding to, is you do need to make sure that, and I think in fairness, it was what you were saying as well earlier, which is, if you look around the table, are they all the same kind of people like you? Even with my background, which is, I don't think, didn't come from a particularly privileged background, but are they all Oxford graduates? Are they Cambridge graduates? Are they all kind of privileged Americans, from Ivy League or whatever? And the answer is, actually, when I was in my last years, we had Americans in key positions. They were not particularly, we had we've still got a New Zealand Italian New Zealander born in Kuwait who's in charge of Asia. So we do have some diverse views. Could we do a bit more? Probably, yeah.
Lady in the white, in that row.
Thank you so much for your insights. I read a fantastic book this year, which I have the FT to thank for the recommendation, Putin's People by Catherine Belton. I just wondered, what is the best book you've read this year, whether it's novel or not?
Yeah, Catherine was a colleague, and I worked with her on a number of those stories, and it's an amazing book. And she's now being intimidated by the oligarchs. They don't want to be called oligarchs, by the way, just in case anybody's thinking of suing me. So I say about that. But and of course, it's a complete accident that they're all suing her at the same time. The best book, I'm actually halfway through it, I think is really good, is The Aristocracy of Merit by Adrian Wooldridge. And the second, former colleague of mine, I'd much recommend it. I think it's a great book, really good book, is Empireland by Satnam Sanghera, which is the whole story of the kind of colonial empire viewed through, again, somebody talk about a modest background, and his is a lot more modest than mine. His parents didn't really speak English. They had a mental health problem in the family in Wolverhampton. And he's just written a great book about the kind of decolonization colonial experience. And it's not a polemic. It's a subtle book. It's a great book. But Aristocracy of Merit, big subject. Very well written.
Thank you so much.
The person right next to you.
Thanks. I listened to your Intelligence Squared conversation at the end of last year, and I think it was just as Trump was beginning to get censored, and you said it was the role of the networks to let the spool run and then qualify the untruths at the end.
Yeah.
I just want to get some commentary around whether the untruths matter to the audience anymore, and this growing ambivalence towards letting things fly that we may not have seen previously.
Yeah, you've done your research. So I still think that to cut the President of the United States off, when he's begun to speak, I think he was guilty of incitement, but I think that you can't make that judgment if you've cut him off. I think it's all about putting remarks and observations in context. I think that if you I was flipping from channel to channel. The ITV, by the way, they went into the building. They did the best job compared to the army of American correspondents. They were in the building. You could see what this mob was like, who they were. It was amazing TV. Now, I think, and look, I'm speaking now to you as the next generation. You have a duty to speak up when you're seeing things that are blatantly wrong. And if you just say, well, there's nothing we can do, that kind of is a counsel of despair. Journalism, you have to continue to say, report what's being said, and if it's wrong, you don't call it a lie. I think that's a big thing. You have to be careful about that word because it can easily be degraded or downgraded. But we cannot be in a position of just saying it doesn't matter. And here in this country, we're seeing a bit of that. I mean, Boris Johnson, I've known him for 30 years. I was in Brussels. I watched the tall stories that he wrote. And you think, wait a minute, I was in the same press conference. I don't remember this. And he'd write this story about the Tower of Babel, which was the new block that was going to contain all the Brussels interpreters. I mean, it's a great joke. It's not true. So people need to stand up, but you can't necessarily, you've got to be very careful if you're, say, on the BBC, where you're trying to encourage the journalists to, for the silver bullet that's going to blow Boris out of the sky. That is a dangerous path, because if you pull the trigger before it's there, the public is just going to go, you know what? Think about Cummings. Cummings is actually degrading and downgrading his ammunition because he's coming up with such a stud of stuff. I mean, he's a very brilliant guy. He's slightly sinister. But, some of it's unprovable. So the press has a job to report, but also sift and put in context. It's a long answer, but please don't succumb to cynicism.
All right, last question from you in the blue in the front row.
Thanks so much for a really interesting talk.
Thank you, Mr. You in the blue. Sorry, just.
I was just wondering what you see the role of the daily print paper to be in the 24/7.
The daily what?
The daily print newspaper to be in the 24/7 digital news cycle.
So we thought a lot about this, and I had conversations, and you need to see the newspaper as at least two things. Number one, it is that snapshot in time where people are going to have a different reading experience, lean back as opposed to lean forward on the digital because everything's fast and you're pressing buttons and everything. It's a different reading experience. You're going to absorb more. And the print is there to sort of say, this is what kind of is going to stand the course of time rather than be instantly forgotten. So there is a concept, it's not mine, but we didn't nick it, we borrowed it. We asked We asked actually Martin Johnson to come from Sweden, from Stockholm, from Dagens Nyheter, to explain the concept of slow and fast news. And what we meant, fast news is simple. You get that with the website. It's like the news now. It's the breaking news. Whereas the slow news is, this is the result of a lot of planning. It's been prepared, a lot of prepared commissioning. And you can slot things in where clearly in the newspaper where the time doesn't matter so much, but it's the result of deeper reporting. So then the person's going to read the newspaper and go, oh, right, you know, there's something more. Now, there are obvious places for that with long reads or whatever. And then on the paper, it's just, this is the most important thing. I still think there's a role for that. And lastly, it's for the FT, because it's pink, it's still obviously part of the brand. So, you know, people go, I mean, in my day in New York, it was called a fashion accessory. I think that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but, you know, we went along with that. So I think snapshot in time, slow news, brand, and, you know, it's tangible, different reading experience. And we can hang on to it for a while. And still, even though print has gone, so advertising has gone like that, it's sort of tailed off, it's not going continue disappearing. So it's still got value there. People feel it's valuable. If you look at The Spectator, I'm a bit of an admirer of The Spectator. It's got a very good editor, but also a revived New Statesman, Prospect to a degree too. These are print products. They're offering something different. They're offering very high quality writing. And I think newspapers, if they're smart and they've got resources, they can plan to put stuff in there which you can't get elsewhere. And it's a different reading experience.
I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much, Lionel, for being here with us at Cambridge today.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed, by the way, great interview.
Thank you.
No, you did a great job. Seriously. Thank you for coming. As I say, I really appreciate the fact that you've got out from under your exam timetable. It's amazing. I didn't expect this many people here. So thanks.
Just a reminder of the events that are coming up this week at the Union. Tonight, we have our penultimate debate of term on the motion, "This House prefers the screen to the page," and it's open to all. Tomorrow, FLY, the network for women and non-binary people of color, is taking over the Union with a special forum. On Saturday, we're hosting AJ Tracy, and on Sunday, we're hosting Steel Bangles. Have a great rest of the week, and thank you again for coming. If you could just wait till a head of events management dismisses you row by row, that would be great. Thanks again.